Well, thank you very much indeed for coming along to the death slot. That's the slot immediately after lunch. It's quite extraordinary that how few people in audiences really understand what speakers can see in the audience. I can spot everyone nodding off. So for those of you who had too much wine at lunch, I will spot you immediately. If you were here yesterday and you heard my little talk on Britain's greatest battle, you would have heard me say that I won, being really honest, because I was a better debater than anyone else. Well, that was 2013. In 2011, when I debated Britain's greatest general, I didn't tie with Wellington because I was a brilliant debater. Slim won, effectively, on his own merits. And what I'm going to do this afternoon is simply represent the proposal that I made in 2011 as to why Slim should be regarded by all of us as Britain's greatest general. I need also to say that he's probably in the audience today. But the reason why I tied with Wellington is that there was one friend of mine, no longer a friend, I haven't spoken to him since, who listened to the debate and said he voted for Wellington. It was a complete outrage. So you know that it was snatched from Slim. Slim won, really. Slim was Britain's greatest general. And I'm simply going to present the case today from his experience of leading what started off to be the Eastern Army in August 1943, very quickly became the 14th Army, all the way through to the end of the war 2 years later. Lance Corporal George MacDonald Fraser of the Border Regiment. If you haven't read this book, you've really seriously missed out on your education. You need to go and buy it and read it now. Quartered safe out here. Was resting after hard fighting in Burma in early 1945 when occurred one of the defining moments of his young life. And I interviewed George MacDonald Fraser and he told me the story with tears in his eyes. His battalion, the Border Regiment, had crossed the Chindwin and had been fighting against a tenacious and skillful enemy on its way towards the mighty Irrawaddy, cutting across Upper Burma. His battalion had a visitor, none other than the Army commander, Lieutenant General Sir William Slim. He was Sir by this time, known to all as Uncle Bill. For the vast majority of soldiers at any time in history, the visit of a senior officer is really a cause for celebration, as it usually involves things that make a soldier's life more rather than less burdensome. But this occasion was very different. Slim's visit had an effect on the young George MacDonald Fraser and his comrades that the young, cynical Lance Corporal was not expecting. Let me read to you what happened as he described it to me. The biggest boost to morale was the burly man who came to talk to the assembled battalion by the lake shore. I'm not sure exactly when, but it was unforgettable. Slim was like that, the only man I've ever seen who had a force come out of him, a strength of personality that I've puzzled over ever since. His appearance was plain enough, large, heavily built, grim-faced with that hard mouth and bulldog chin. The rakish Gurkha hat was at odds with the slung carbine and untidy trouser bottoms. Nor was he an orator. His delivery was blunt, matter-of-fact, without gestures or mannerisms, only a lack of them. He knew how to make an entrance, or rather he probably didn't, and it came naturally. Slim emerged from under the trees by the lake shore. There was no nonsense of gather around chaps or jumping on boxes. He just stood there with his thumb hooked in his carbine sling, and he talked about how we had caught Jap off balance and we were going to annihilate him in the open. There was no exhortation or ringing cliches, no jokes or self-conscious use of barrack room slang. When he called the Japs bastards, it was casual and without heat. He was telling us informally what would be, in a reflective way of intimate conversation. And we believed every word of it, because it all came true. I think it was that sense of being close to us, as though he was chatting offhand to an understanding nephew, that was his great gift. You knew when he talked of smashing the Jap that to him it meant not only arrows on a map, but clearing bunkers and going in under shell fire, that he had the head of a general with the heart of a private soldier. George MacDonald Fraser saw in Bill Slim that hot day, the first time he'd ever met him, in February 1945, many of the characteristics of exceptional generalship that makes me believe unequivocally that Slim was Britain's greatest ever general. Indeed, I would suggest that there were at least 6 reasons for so thinking. The first reason was that he was first and foremost, a born leader of soldiers. He inspired confidence because he instinctively knew that the strength of an army lay not in its equipment, traditions, or even doctrine, but in the training and morale of its soldiers and the personal competence and leadership of its officers. During the retreat from Burma in 1942, he had gone to visit a unit that he'd been told was in a bad way. He soon found out why, observing that the officers were looking after themselves rather than the men. This was, to him, entirely unacceptable. Officers existed to lead, and the interest of their men came well ahead of their own. Slim told an audience of officers joining the 14th Army in 1944, "I tell you, therefore, as officers, that you will neither eat nor drink, nor sleep nor smoke, nor even sit down until you have personally seen that your men have done these things. If you will do this for them, they will follow you to the end of the world. And if you do not, I will break you." By means of this attitude, Slim helped to create the widespread feeling amongst troops of all nationalities in India and Burma that the 14th Army was a family. It's been observed that Slim inspired such affection among the men of the 14th Army that they always spoke of fighting with, not under him. By 1944, the epithet "Forgotten Army" was no longer an excuse, but a source of pride. Like his visit to George MacDonald Fraser's battalion, Slim made tremendous efforts to communicate with his men, travelling vast distances to talk to them, simply and honestly, as man to man. He never engaged in histrionics or tricks of oratory, and through these events, his strong and attractive personality, as Fraser was able to attest, shone through. His firm view was that the most important attribute of a leader was his effect on morale, and he did everything he could to ensure that he was seen and trusted by his men. He inspired confidence because he related to the men, not as subordinates. He was the antithesis of the Chateau General, who never ventured far from the comfort of his headquarters, far to the rear of the action. He brought his men into his confidence in a way that was very unusual at the time, the result of the complete absence in his personal makeup of any social pretension. John Twells was a young officer in the Gurkhas who was attached to a Madrasi battalion on the Chinwin River in December 1943. And Slim came to speak to his battalion, and he spoke in Urdu and Hindi. And Slim gathered the battalion around him, a young Madrasi battalion. This is a battalion not from the martial races, but a new battalion, the new Indian Army, raised to fight the Japanese. And Slim told them, in a very matter-of-fact way, in a way that John Twells couldn't really believe. It was an extraordinary event for all these young soldiers to be listening to the army commander. And the army commander told them that the Japanese would soon be crossing this very river. And what were they going to do about it? What was the 14th Army going to do about it? And Slim told them that they were going to withdraw unto the hills. They were going to withdraw into Manipur. They were going to draw the Japanese in after them. And when they'd drawn the Japanese into Manipur and Assam, they would come at them, the 14th Army would come at them with air, artillery, and infantry and destroy them. What's so extraordinary about this? This is December 1943. This is 3 months before it even happened. Slim knew he was one of only 2 people in India that had access to ultra-intelligence, and he knew that on the 15th of March 1944, Mutiguchi would launch his 15th Army into India. In fact, it began a week before, began on the 7th, but that was the intelligence that Ultra was able to provide. What's really extraordinary about this story? What's really extraordinary is that the army commander was trusting young Indian soldiers, Madrasi soldiers, in a new battalion, the greatest state secret there was, that we, the Allies, knew when the Japanese were coming. Not only that, but he told the young Madrasi soldiers his plan. He trusted them with the plan. Of course, there was no way they were going to tell the Japanese. They couldn't do that, but he trusted them with the plan. What's more important, what's more extraordinary to those young men, as told by John Twells, was that all of this came true. And the unique thing about this, of course, is that what John Twells was able to relay was exactly what George MacDonald Fraser relayed in 1945. Here was the army commander coming to talk to his young soldiers, trusting them, bringing them into his thinking, persuading them that there was a plan that would work. And when the Japanese invasion came, what did the 14th Army do? It fought and it withdrew into the hills. There was no argument. Well, there were a few, but there was no major argument in the 14th Army about the rightness of this plan. They weren't withdrawing. They were bringing the Japanese in. Slim had told them this in advance, and they believed it because it happened. Slim knew his men and could communicate with them because he was one of them. And in the bloody days in Gallipoli and Mesopotamia during the First World War and in the interwar years on the northwest frontier, he had experienced their bitterest trials. Not for him the aristocratic or privileged middle-class upbringing of many of his peers, but an early life in industrial Birmingham, relieved only by the opportunities presented by the upheavals of the First World War. Born in 1891, Slim left school at 16 due to the impoverishment of his family. He spent 2 years teaching some of the most hardened youngsters to be found in Birmingham before going to work on the shop floor of an engineering company. These experiences meant that when he became chief of the Imperial General Staff on the 1st of January 1949, it could be said of him that he had never forgotten the smell of soldiers' feet. He understood men, wrote the Australian journalist Ronald McKee, who met him in Burma. He spoke their language as he moved among them. From forward positions to training bases, he had the richest of common sense, a dour soldier's humor, and a simple earthly wisdom. Wherever he moved, he raised morale. He was the finest of Englishmen. Now, from an Australian, that's saying something. Frank Owen, the Fleet Street editor who watched him closely in India and Burma for 2 years, observed, "Slim does not court popularity, and he hates publicity, but he inspires trust. The man cares deeply for his troops, and they are well aware that their well-being is his permanent priority." As a result, the men of the 14th Army, British, Indian, African, and Gurkha, and indeed troops from the Royal Nepalese Army, gave him their loyalty in a way rarely shown or seen in the annals of command. And I suggested yesterday that it would be inconceivable to think of Field Marshal Montgomery as Uncle Bernard. But it was to Uncle Bill that soldiers in Burma from the dark days of 1942 and 1943 through to the great victories over the Japanese in 1944 and 45 put their confidence. Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten declared that the entire 14th Army became his devoted slaves. He was surely right. His soldiers followed him willingly and joined the Burma Star Association, which he established after the war, in their many tens of thousands, and which remains alive and thriving today as the Burma Star Memorial Fund. No other veteran organization from the Second World War can boast the same longevity. My second reason was that he was able to cope with defeat and learn from it. Slim first came to the attention of the British Army in a significant way between March and May 1942, when he ensured that the 100-day, 1,000-mile retreat from Burma to India, the longest in the long history of the British Army, was, whilst a bitter humiliation, not, nevertheless, a rout. He managed the withdrawal through Dust Bowl, jungle, and mountain alike so deftly that the Japanese, although undoubtedly victorious, were utterly exhausted and unable to mount offensive operations into India for a further year. As Slim said farewell to his troops in the days before his departure from Imphal on the 20th of May 1942, he received an accolade reserved only for the likes of a Napoleon or a Wellington. His troops cheered him. They'd just come back from Burma and had been defeated. His troops cheered him. To be cheered by troops whom you have led to victory is grand and exhilarating, he commented. To be cheered by the gaunt remnants of those whom you have led only to defeat, withdrawal, and disaster is infinitely moving and humbling. The defeat in Burma in 1942 identified a side to Slim that would perhaps not otherwise have become apparent. It marked him out as a commander of considerable mental stamina, a man who was tough and tenacious in the face of almost overwhelming adversity, who refused to give up when all the facts seemed to indicate that there was no hope for his bedraggled and defeated forces. He was not afraid of anything, recorded the American General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, and he looked it. He remained calm and level-headed in public, controlling his emotions with iron discipline. This composure, a remarkable feature of Slim, made a dramatic and decisive impact on his men. Major Michael Calvert recalled watching Slim during the hot, dusty days of the withdrawal, the Corps commander, commander of the Burma Corps, presenting an indomitable and unshaken front in the face of these disasters, and his rather ponderous jokes cheered his staff and commanders when they were at their lowest ebb. When the 26-year-old Major Ian Lyle Grant, incidentally, the photograph earlier of Masao Hirakubu, and the gentleman in the photograph was Major General Ian Lyle Grant. Major at the time, 26 years old, met him during the second week of April 1942, with only 6 weeks of the retreat from Burma left to run. He was, despite the otherwise apparent hopelessness of the situation, buoyed up by Slim's calm reassurance that the situation, though bleak, was under control. After listening to Slim brief them on the Ava Bridge near Mandalay, he and his fellows felt for the first time that they now had a leader who realized that new methods were required to counter Japanese tactics, and he was prepared to think them out. My third reason is that Slim demonstrated how to rebuild an army conditioned to defeat. In 1943, Slim was given the opportunity no British or Indian soldier has been given since the days of Wellington, the chance to train an army from scratch and to single-handedly mold it into something of his own making, an army of extraordinary spirit and power against which nothing ultimately could stand, and which would sweep to victory against the Japanese in 1944 and 1945. By 1945, Slim's 14th Army, at 606,000 men, the largest ever assembled by Britain, had decisively and successfully defeated two formidable Japanese armies. The first, as you all know, at Imphal and Kohima in India in 1944, and the second on the banks of the mighty Irrawaddy along the infamous road to Mandalay in Burma in 1945. Everything he did as a commander was designed to equip his men for the trials of battle. And as I've said, their interests were always at the forefront of his plans. He believed that soldiers needed to be fed before they could march, trained before they could fight, and relieved before they were worn out. In addition to giving them the mental and practical wherewithal to fight the Japanese, one of the most fearsome armies the British or Indians have ever had to face, Slim took many practical steps to improve his soldiers' health and welfare. His entire approach to building up of the fighting power of an army from a situation of profound defeat and in the face of crippling resource constraints was built on the twin platforms of rigorous training and the development of each individual's will to win. To achieve the latter, he developed single-handedly a deeply thought-out program of support designed to meet the physical, intellectual, and spiritual needs of each fighting man. By the spiritual principle, he meant that there must be a great and a noble object. Its achievement must be vital, the method of achievement must be active and aggressive, and each man must feel that he that what he is and what he does matters directly to the achievement or attainment of that object. It was critical, he argued, that all troops of whatever rank, background and nationality believed in the cause they were fighting for. The cause itself had to be just. In Burma, Slim wrote, "We fought for the clean, the decent, the free things of life. We fought only because the powers of evil had attacked these things." By the intellectual principle, he meant that soldiers had to be convinced that the object could be obtained. The principal task was to destroy the notion that the Japanese soldier was invincible. Equally, each soldier had also to know that the organization to which he belonged was an efficient one. Slim knew that the physical care of a soldier in the field had a direct bearing on his performance in battle. The lack of food, water, and medical support or contact with home works to weaken the resolve over time of even the stoutest man. And by the material foundation, Slim meant that each man had to feel that he would get a fair deal from his commanders and from the army generally, that he would, as far as humanly possible, be given the best weapons and equipment for his task, and that his living and working conditions would be made as good as they could be. This leads me to my fourth reason. Slim was phenomenally successful in battle. First, he prevented, by his dogged command of the withdrawal from Burma, the invasion of India proper in 1942 by a Japanese army exulting in its omnipotence after the collapse of the rest of East Asia and the Pacific Rim. Next, he removed forever any further Japanese ambitions to invade India proper by his destruction of the Japanese invasion of India in the Naga Hills around Kohima and on the Manipur Plain around Imphal in the spring and early summer of 1944. And in so doing, he decisively shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, which had for so long crippled the Allied cause. Then, as we heard yesterday, despite the worries of many in Delhi and London, and subtly influencing Mountbatten to conform to his own strategy, Slim drove his armoured, foot and mule-borne and air-transported troops deep into Burma in late 1944 and early 1945, across two of the world's mightiest rivers, to outwit and outfight the 250,000-strong Burma Area Army of General Kimura, and in so doing, engineer the complete collapse of the Japanese in Burma. Given the pattern of British misfortune in 1942 and in 1943, it is not fanciful to argue that without Slim, neither the safety of India in 1942, as indeed in 1944, nor indeed the recovery of Burma in 1945 would ever have been possible. Slim's leadership and drive came to dominate the 14th Army to such a degree that it became, in Jack Master's wonderful phrase, an extension of his own personality. I attributed that to Mountbatten. It's not. It's Jack Master's. My fifth reason was that Slim was a remarkable coalition commander. The army that defeated the might of the Japanese in both India and Burma during 1944 and 1945, as you now know, was a thoroughly imperial one, 90% of which was Indian, Gurkha, and African, 87% Indian, in fact, and 10% British. Even in the British Empire of the time, it was not self-evident that a British officer, even in the employ of the Indian Army, would secure the commitment of the various diverse nationalities he commanded. Indeed, many did not. In his fascinating study of military command, the late psychiatrist Professor Norman Dixon, considered Slim's quite obvious ability to join many of these diverse national groups to fight together in a single cause to be nothing less than remarkable and the antithesis of the norm. That Slim did so at a time of social and political unrest in India with the anti-colonial Quit India campaign, and in the face of some early desertions to the Japanese-sponsored Indian National Army, make his achievements even the more remarkable. Dixon concluded that the affection shown to him by British, Indian, Nepalese, African, Chinese, Gurkha, and American troops, the distinction between Nepalese and Gurkha is again this reality that the Kingdom of Nepal gave the Indian Army 19 battalions to help the Indian Army fight the war against the Japanese. These all led to Slim being loved by his polyglot army, I quote from Dixon, perhaps more than any other commander has been loved by his men since Nelson. The British soldier was also suspicious of officers of the Indian Army, of whom, of course, Slim was, but Slim succeeded effortlessly in winning them over too. He was, and I quote, the only Indian Army general of my acquaintance that ever got himself across to British troops, recalled Bernard Ferguson, himself a Chindit column commander. Monosyllables do not usually carry a cadence, he said, but to thousands of British troops, as well as to Indians and to his own beloved Gurkhas, there will always be a special magic in the words, Bill Slim. My sixth and final reason for ascribing to Slim the title of Britain's greatest general was his approach to warfare, which at the time was very different to received wisdom across the British Armed Forces, and which is his abiding legacy. Indeed, his approach to fighting forms the underpinning of modern British military doctrine. He was never a theoretician of war, although after the war, the First World War, he became for a short time Commandant of the Royal College of Defence Studies. After the Second World War. Rather, he was a very intensely practical strategist. At his heart, he was a proponent of the maxim taught to him when he was a young officer by a hoary old sergeant major. Hit the other fellow as quick as you can and as hard as you can, where it hurts him most, when he ain't looking. Slim's entire approach to strategy was to exploit his enemy's weaknesses and, by so doing, undermine his will to win. He did this successfully in Syria in 1941 and in India and Burma in 1944 and 45. By so doing, he attempted to achieve what I would describe as moral dominance over his enemy, to make the enemy believe that he could not ultimately prevail and that the battle and indeed the campaign was lost. It was an approach to war that was sat in stark contrast to the idea of matching strength with strength and force with force, where the goal of strategy was simply to slog it out with an enemy in an attritional confrontation of the sort expounded by less imaginative commanders, British and others, elsewhere during the war and indeed throughout history. Slim prized above all the virtues of cunning and guile, and he sought opportunities at every turn to trick and deceive the enemy. In the fighting in India and Burma, this required realistic, physically demanding training, the use of air power to supply forward troops, new tactics to fight the Japanese, the delegation of command to the lowest levels, a self-help approach to logistical deficiencies, and a relentless exploitation of the pursuit to ensure that an enemy caught off guard had limited opportunities to recover its equilibrium. The campaigns in India and Burma in 1944 and 45 were to reward Slim's approach to warfare with a victory that few, if any, in 1942 or 1943 foresaw. In 1944, he allowed General Mutaguchi's 100,000-strong 15th Army to extend itself deep into India, there to be met by a ruthlessly determined 4 Corps, supplied by air, and attacking at every opportunity the tenuous Japanese lines of communication back to the Chinwan. And we mustn't ignore 33 Corps at Kohima. It was high risk, and more than one senior officer in Delhi and London despaired of success. Slim, however, knew otherwise, and in the process of the climactic battles of Imphal and Kohima, he succeeded in shattering the cohesion of a whole Japanese army and destroying its will to fight, a situation as yet unheard of for a fully formed Japanese army in the field. There were a number of close calls, and Slim was always the first to admit his mistakes, but his steady nerve never failed. He molded the Japanese offensive to suit his own plans, and step by step, he decisively broke it in the hills of eastern Assam and on the Imphal plain. Many commanders would then have sat on their laurels. Not so Slim. He was convinced that real victory against the Japanese required an aggressive pursuit, not just to the Chinwan, but into the heart of Burma itself. Single-handedly, as we discovered yesterday, he worked to put in place all the ingredients of a bold offensive to seize Mandalay at a time when every inclination in London and Washington was to seek an amphibious solution to the problem of Burma and thus avoid the entanglements of a land offensive. Slim believed, however, that it could be done. Virtually alone, he drove his plans forward, winning agreement and acceptance to his ideas as he went, particularly with Mountbatten, the supreme Allied commander in the Far East, and he went on to execute in Burma in 1945 one of the most brilliant expositions of the strategic art that warfare has ever seen. He did this in the face of difficulties of every sort and degree. Employing his abundant strategic initiative to the full, he succeeded in outwitting and destroying an even larger army under General Kimmerer along the Irrawaddy between Mektila and Mandalay in the spring of 1945, Kimmerer himself describing Slim's operation as the masterstroke of Allied strategy, as indeed it was. Well, what has history had to say about Slim? Every analysis of Slim's achievements in Burma provide evidence of a remarkable military talent. Most are effusive in their praise for him as a military commander. Dr. Duncan Anderson, historian and head of war studies at Sandhurst, places Slim, I quote, in the same class as Guderian, Manstein, and Patton as an offensive commander. Michael Calvert, author and Chindit column commander, described the capture of Mektila in 1945 as bearing the mark of genius. Louis Allen, the first historian of the Burma campaign, described the attack on Mandalay and Mektila as one of the most underestimated strategic masterstrokes in the history of the Second World War. Likewise, the historian, the late Brian Parrott, asserts that Slim had a gift of instinctively recognizing the strategic potential of a situation whilst it was actually developing, and this places him in the foremost rank of blitzkrieg commanders. Lieutenant General Sir Geoffrey Evans, who served under Slim both as a brigade and a divisional commander, concludes of the struggle for Burma in 1945. What Slim had done was to initiate at short notice the most subtle, audacious, and complex operation of his whole career. Its execution revealed that Slim was a complete general, since every element of the military art was required if it were not to fail. Deception and surprise, flexibility, concentration on the objective, calculated risk, the solution of grave administrative problems, imagination, sang-froid, invigorating leadership. All the cliches of the military textbooks, he says, were simultaneously and harmoniously brought to life as Slim, with an absolute assurance, conceived and accomplished his masterpiece. Who am I to disagree? Finally, in a masterful summary of the high command of the Burma campaign, the historian Frank McLean argues that, I quote, "There are solid grounds for asserting that when due allowances have been made, Slim's encirclement of the Japanese on the Irrawaddy deserves to rank with the great military achievements of all time. Alexander at Gaugamela, Hannibal at Cannae, Julius Caesar at Alesia, or Napoleon at Austerlitz in 1805. The often made but actually ludicrous comparison," he goes on to say, "between Montgomery and Slim is relevant here. There is no Montgomery equivalent of the Irrawaddy campaign. His one attempt to prove himself a master of the war of movement, Operation Market Garden, against Arnhem, was a signal and embarrassing failure. Montgomery was a military talent. Slim was a military genius." As I finish, the final word should be left to one who served under him. "Bill Slim was to us," said Anthony Brett James, "a homely sort of general. On his jaw was carved the resolution of an army. In his stern eyes and tight mouth reside all the determination and unremitting courage of a great force. His manner held much of the bulldog, gruff and to the point, believing in every one of us, and as proud of the forgotten army as we were. I believe that his name will descend into history as a badge of honor, as great as that of the old contemptibles." Lord Mountbatten claimed that despite the reputation of others, such as the renowned self-publicist Montgomery Vallamain, it was Slim who should rightly be regarded as the greatest British general of the Second World War. I would go further and describe him as Britain's greatest general. I hope you also agree. There we are. You will notice that all of that is based on first-hand recollections of men who had served with and studied Slim's campaigns. And for that reason, there is no doubt in my mind that Slim was the greatest British general of the Second World War. I've had long debates with my friend Saul David about where he sits in the panoply of great British generals. Saul nudges Slim slightly out in favor of Marlborough. Marlborough's great the Rhine campaigns. But he sits up there in history as one of our greatest ever commanders. And the evidence, so far as I'm concerned, is unequivocal. Are there any questions about my assumptions or about Bill Slim in general? Hugh. Oh.
Every general has a staff behind him. When he was going around impressing his personality on people, did he take a tactical headquarters with him like Rommel or something, or did he have a main headquarters that he would leave with the staff dutifully getting on with stuff while he was away? And if the latter, did he have like particular favourites or protégés that he looked after and took with him at every level of command that he knew he could rely on to deliver when he wasn't there?
It's a great question. He had a main headquarters, and most of the operations were undertaken by Maine, although he had a small tactical headquarters based in his C-47. The Americans gave him a C-47 in 1944, and he flew from Camilla almost on a daily basis around. He was nearly shot out of the sky above Mactila, in fact. But he had half a dozen staff officers who were with him in his TAC headquarters. The nature of his headquarters, all generals, where they can, create their staff around them with men and women, no doubt nowadays, who they trust to deliver. And the great success of Bill Slim by the end of 1943 is that every single one of his divisional corps commanders were men he had placed there himself. Well, with one exception. But that man delivered the goods in 1944. And building up your headquarters, building up your operational structures with people who you trust to deliver for you is absolutely critical. So yes, Slim succeeded with these individuals, but they were his conscious appointments. That's the important point.
Do the West and East Africans hold him in the same affection as clearly we and the Indians do?
Yes, and I did a program with Griff Rhys-Jones in 2013 where we interviewed lots of West Africans, and they do. They hold Slim in great regard, as indeed do the modern armies in the Gambia and Nigeria and in Eastern Africa as well, but less so than the Indians at the time, because most of the Indian troops were fighting in 15 Corps, commanded by Philip Christensen, which in 1944 was separated out from the 14th Army. So they saw less of Bill Slim from February 1944 onwards. But yes. First Indian soldier I interviewed said, oh, Bill Slim, yes, Cha-Cha Bill Slim, Cha-Cha Slim Saab, Uncle Bill. So it wasn't just an English expression, it was an Indian expression as well. Cha-Cha Slim Saab, yes.
How many staff officers did he have?
Tiny number. So the very large staff headquarters that you see today didn't exist at the time. He, off the top of my head, 10 or 12 senior staff officers in Camilla doing the major stuff, commanding an army of 606,000. But these were men of exceptional ability. And I'll just give you one example of some of the challenges that Slim's army faced, because it might seem very glib for me to say that Slim saw the opportunity of pursuit. Well, the opportunity of pursuit can only be successful if he's able to take his army across the Chindwan first. And if you've seen the Chindwan, in some parts it's 8 miles wide. And then the Irrawaddy. How are you going to do that? How are you going to get 606,000 men across the Chindwan and the Irrawaddy without boats or indeed bridges? Do you know what the answer is? He chopped down forests of teak and built 550 10-ton barges. 550 10-ton barges, which were, the wood wasn't seasoned, they were just sawn on site, put together, slapped with bitumen, lots and lots of bitumen in that part of Burma, and floated and used, and a 10-ton barge could carry a Grant tank or a Sherman tank across the Chindwan. When I first went to Burma, many years ago, some of those barges were still in operation taking teak logs down the Irrawaddy. 550. Just think about the enormity of that exercise. The only way you could pursue the enemy was by creating a solution to the problems you faced. Slim and his staff did that in a way that would be inconceivable to anyone thinking about it today, in my view. We'll come back to you, Simon.
Hello, I'm no expert on military strategy, but I was interested to say that you said he opposed a amphibious landing. So a follow-on question is, did Gallipoli actually make him as a general?
No, he didn't oppose an amphibious landing, but strategy often is about what you can make of it. So, there is a difference between creating grand strategy in London and Washington and then executing that strategy, what we describe as military strategy on the ground. Slim actually was a strategic opportunist. And after he could see the collapse of the 15th Army in Manipur and Assam in June 1944, and he persuaded Mountbatten that instead of the grand strategic imperative to launch an amphibious operation against Rangoon and then Malaya, Burma could be taken by land with no further resources than Slim had already had given to him. And in the talk yesterday, I described how Slim was able to persuade Mountbatten by writing to him and explaining that actually this was achievable. He could get across the Chindwan. He could chase the tail of the 15th Army into Upper Burma. A strategic question that Churchill in particular had been opposed to from the start. Now, going into Upper Burma was actually what the Chinese wanted the British to do, and the Chinese persuaded Roosevelt that this was the primary purpose of the global relationship between America, China, and Britain. Britain was always reluctant to do it because it had had its fingers burnt in 1942, and it believed a better way of defeating the Japanese was by bypassing them completely. Slim had a different view by the middle of 1944, which is that the Japanese could be beaten, and so long as the pressure could be maintained on Motiguchi and then General Kimura, the Japanese could be destroyed in Burma as well. And that takes guts. It takes quite an extraordinary calculation of risk, and it also means you've got to be able to have the ability in your army to solve all those problems, like the logistics one I described, and to take the opportunity where it presents himself. He was a strategic opportunist, but he made the right call.
So especially as you mentioned Mr. Churchill, you don't think there was a Gallipoli monkey on his back?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Gallipoli was very important because it was where Slim, a young officer in the Warwickshire Regiment, first came across the Gurkhas, 6 Gurkha rifles, and he ended up, after the First World War, joining the Gurkhas and becoming part of that particular family. Simon.
I remember being told anecdotally by my father that whenever a unit in the front line was on half rations, Slim put his staff on half rations.
Yes, that's true, yeah.
That's good to have that verified. And
Yeah.
also, is it right he read or even wrote novels in the evening?
Yes, he did. Right, thanks for that plug. This is really good. So between 1931 and 1940, Slim, in order to be able to pay his school fees, wrote 44 articles, some about the Indian Army, some about India, and some just a number of whodunits for newspapers in the UK and in India and indeed in Australia. Mark Slim and I last year pulled them all together from the Churchill Archive Centre in Cambridge, and they've been republished by Sharp Books. They're available now There's an omnibus edition called The General Wondered Why, the title of one of his magnificent articles, and I would encourage you all to go away and buy it. Thank you, Simon. They're great. They're really, really good. He had a real way with words. So you will all, of course, have read and enjoyed Defeat into Victory. If you were wondering when you read Defeat into Victory about why Slim was such a master of the pen, just go back and read The General Wondered Why, and you'll see that his way with words was really quite exceptional.
You mentioned there, Rob, the incident where he was nearly shot out of the sky at Mactilla. Was that by Japanese airplane or ACAC?
No,
or?
Japanese anti-aircraft, because at Thabutkan, the airfield close to Mactilla, the plan was that the 7th Indian Division would cross at a place called Pakiku and then drive north along the south bank of the Irrawaddy to persuade Kimura that actually their objective was Mandalay, and then at the last minute to turn right and drop down at Thabutkan, where the 99th Brigade was flown in under fire onto the Japanese airfield, seized the airfield. The tanks of Probyn's Horse arrived, 255 Brigade, and then the 99 Brigade and 255 Brigade then moved on and jumped onto Mactilla, this great surprise attack on Mactilla. Slim was flying above the aircraft that were landing, and his aircraft was targeted by anti-aircraft fire, and at least one person in the C-47 was badly wounded. Slim cursed himself for taking that risk and causing that injury and got out of there pretty quickly. He described it as it was an unforgivable act of battlefield tourism. Right at the back there.
Your final slide behind you poses somewhat of a dilemma. Clearly the greatest British general of the war. Why was his subsequent military career less of a success?
I think it was a great success. He became the first sepoy general to become Chief of the Imperial General Staff. He was appointed in 1948 by Attlee. He became Chief of the Imperial General Staff on the 1st of January 1949. At a time of considerable change in the British Army, there was an enormous amount of restructuring and reduction going on. Britain had joined NATO and was building up a land commitment to the continent for the first time ever. That had been a mistake prior to the First World War, not having a continental commitment. Anyone who's read my recent book with Richard Dannett, Victory to Defeat, sorry, it's another plug, will realize that we should really have had a continental commitment to the 1930s as well. This is where war was going to come again, and we were unprepared for it. We didn't make that mistake in 1949, and we still haven't made that mistake. He oversaw the commitment to NATO. And actually, it's very interesting because the land commander in NATO at the time, it wasn't called that until 1950, was Montgomery, and Slim and Montgomery got on fabulously well. We then had, on the 25th of June 1950, the beginning of the Korean War, which was an extraordinary war, which Slim oversaw in the extension of national service and entailed not just a remarkable commitment from the British Army, but also a remarkable and developing relationship with the United States. Many people today, when they look back in history, think that it's the Second World War that constructed the post-war strategic security apparatus. It wasn't. In 1945, at the end of the Second World War, America reduced its forces globally and numerically in a dramatic fashion. And it was only the Korean War that forced them to rethink a global position where they had permanent bases abroad and included a commitment to NATO. Slim was the CIGS throughout all of that, and it's an extraordinary story. And his biographers don't deal with it as well as they should. But it's particularly this relationship with America, I think in 1950 and 51, that Slim played a very, very powerful hand. Some of you will know that MacArthur at the time, not just MacArthur, but Truman, the American president, was openly contemplating the use of nuclear weapons against China. Who in Britain was opposing that? Well, the fight was led by Bill Slim, CIGS. Quite an extraordinary story. So he had a very spectacular career afterwards. For a man who left the British Army, or the Indian Army rather, at the end of 1945, to become chairman of British Rail, and was called back by Attlee in 1948 to be CIGS. When he was appointed CIGS, remember, he had been a senior officer in the Indian Army. His son John was at a course in end of 1948 at the School of Infantry in Warminster. And when the announcement was made that the new CIGS would be Bill Slim, the entire mess erupted in cheers. The entire British mess erupted in cheers. So that gives you some demonstration of how he was held and his success as a very, very senior commander. Any others?
Just following on that period. Sorry, you mentioned he got on well with Montgomery in those years. What about Ismay?
He got on very well with Pug Ismay.
Did he?
Yes. Another plug, not by me. John Kisley, who's a good friend of mine, has written a new biography of Pug Ismay. It's coming out on the 1st of May. He was quite an extraordinary man, Pug Ismay. Pug Ismay was effectively Winston Churchill's chief of staff. He was the man who ran his military office and was the interlocutor between Churchill and the chiefs. He was really quite a remarkable politician. And he got on very well with Ismay, who had been, of course, promoted to command of, was it the Western European Union? I can't recall. He was the first head of NATO, that's right. Yes, and I haven't read John's book, but he's an exceptional historian, and I'll be reviewing it soon. Any other questions?
Any more questions in the room? One more.
Let's final one?
Yes.
Final question.
You've spoken a lot about what other people thought of him. What were his reflections on his achievements during the war? And
He was a remarkably humble man. I mean, we've talked about this, and I've talked about this with Mark and the family. He never blew his own trumpet, and that might actually be seen as a failing because he used this phrase. He said, "Victory has a music all of its own. I don't need to trumpet the success, my success as a commander. I don't need to trumpet the success of the 14th Army." He assumed that this dramatic series of victories, and as we discussed yesterday, there were only 3 Japanese armies deployed and defeated in the Second World War. First deployed and defeated in Imphal and Kohima in 1944. Second, General Kawabe's army, General Kimura's army rather, in 1945. And the third, the army of Manchukuo, defeated by Zhukov in 1945. Slim defeated 2 of those, the 14th Army. Really quite remarkable achievement. And yet we know actually that if unless you make a song and a dance about it, unless you develop the propaganda, unless you spin, not the propaganda, but unless you utilize all the vehicles of publicity, people are going to chase the noise. And they chase the noise. That was actually something that Monty intuitively understood. And he made a lot of noise. And Slim didn't. So Defeat and Victory is a really quite remarkable and reflective book. He spent a lot of time analysing what went wrong, analysing his own failures, and blaming himself for his short-sightedness on some occasions. The most critical failure was actually the determination as to whether Kohima or Dimapur was going to be the site of Motiguchi's attack. Fortunately, the Japanese also made a mistake and went for Kohima, and they shouldn't have done, but that's another book. Are we done?
Yeah, I believe so. I think a round of applause is due. As we conclude, I'd like to thank Dr. Robert Lyman for joining us today for this event. With the endless plugs, there are books still available upstairs and outside with the KAT and the National Army Museum bookshop. The Kohima Educational Trust and the National Army Museum both have active programs that you can participate in to learn more about the history of the British Army. The Kohima Educational Trust run monthly webinars, whilst the National Army Museum run free lunchtime lectures every week on a Friday. They are both in person and online, and you can find out more via our respective websites. We can also give a plug to next year. This is a long way off, but Burma 1945 will be an exhibition that will be run here at the National Army Museum, and we'll probably do a lot more events involving this for that. Thank you to Rob for a wonderful talk, and I think Bill Slim is the greatest general. To the Kohima Educational Trust for developing this event. We hope to see you again soon for the final 2 events. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.